Jenny Sparks, issue 5. Tom King writing, Jeff Spokes on the art. All right, Connor gets a small break whilst
I
I
do get a break, yeah.
talk about this. So, me and Matt said last time that issue 1 of this was pretty much perfect, but the book itself is probably one of the weaker Tom King series, just because it's not quite hitting quite the same way that a lot of his other stuff has. And so I went into this issue with kind of muted expectations because of how I felt about the last one. But this issue was, really solidly written, and it kind of does the same thing where the flashbacks of the story go back to a time in recent history, and we sort of see what Jenny was doing. In this case, it's actually the night after the US election in 2016, where this drunk guy at a bar is basically just commiserating about the fact that his daughter was excited about having the first female president, and then the next morning had to be told that it didn't win. The other guy won. The monster won. And it's continuing this trend of Jenny being around all these awful things that have happened in the last 20 years in this century. But it basically is our first encounter. Well, not our first encounter, but it's an encounter with Batman and Superman where they show up in their civvies. Well, Superman shows up in his civvies as Clark Kent. Batman shows up as Matches Malone. And Jenny immediately knows who it is and just can guess. But they're there, so the flashback story is about them recruiting her to police superheroes, to be someone who keeps an eye on them because the world's getting more complicated and they want someone to keep them in line. That's what they sort of bring her on board for, which she agrees by the end of the issue to do. So that's interesting to see, especially like Superman and Batman kind of admitting that, the world's more complicated now. It's kind of darker than it used to be. And hell, there's even the drunk guy in the bar even says, the 90s were so much better. No one seemed to care about the serious thing in the 90s. Things just seemed to be gradually getting better and it was fine. And then all of a sudden there's all this stuff where you have to be sort of politically and morally on your toes all the time. And regardless of how true or not you find those statements to be, it's definitely the sentiment that the book's kind of poking at and prodding at. So that stuff's pretty interesting. There's some joke stuff as well where someone tries to mug them when they're out in the alleyway and she just starts laughing because she's with Superman and Batman. And it's all very nice. And then the other stuff, the other half of the story is Jenny talking to the psychiatrist who was cured of cancer by Captain Atom. And basically explaining to him who Captain Atom is and what his backstory is, about how he kind of seemed to keep going back to war, even though he had a wife and kids at home. He agreed to do this experiment because he got arrested and basically he was going to be sentenced to death for something that he'd done during combat in another country. And this was at a time when white men could get away with a lot of stuff, but he was going to get the book thrown at him for something. So he agreed to this experiment where he'd go inside the alien spaceship, which the US government had gotten hold of, and they were going to test to see if someone could survive being inside of it when it was hit with a nuclear blast. And we see some art of this, and the art is really nice. The nuclear blast looks great, and I especially like though when it turns out that he wasn't unharmed. That some of the material of the ship melted onto him, that. Those panels look really cool actually, because that's effectively his origin. And then the idea that he showed it took decades. His wife had grown old with another husband at this point, and he showed up one night out of the blue, decades later, saying it stopped hurting. The idea that the pain of this transformation lasted decades, and he became a superhero because the government said, you've got superpowers, so now you're a superhero. So that's what he became, and he was very kind of apathetic about it. But Jenny is telling this all to the old psychiatrist who was cured of cancer because she wants his help to go back in and deal with them. And it turns out this guy who was cured of cancer, who should be jumping for the moon because he's been completely cured of everything that was wrong with him. His eyesight's better, everything. He was touched by God. He actually, there's a sadness to this in that he was actually looking forward to dying because his wife is already dead. His wife had gotten ill and died some time prior, and he was kind of looking forward to seeing her again, and this has actually delayed that. And this figure who wants to be called God didn't recognize the difference between tragedy and miracle. That this was actually something bad that he'd done because it was just sort of taken for granted that it was good. So, it's poking at these big ideas and these big themes again of what is right, what is wrong, delving a bit more into the character of Captain Atom and what's currently motivating him. But the more interesting stuff really is how it's been tying into like these events in recent history. One of the best issues was a few issues ago where it was all about the 2008 financial like crisis, right? And me and Matt joked a lot in that issue that we only understood half the dialogue because we'd seen The Big Short. But it really did help because it really it really did like put a lot of it in perspective. So you know, I think
saying you did in fact listen to Margot Robbie in a bathtub.
No, I don't remember a word she said because I was too busy looking at Margot Robbie in a bathtub. But the rest of the movie, when the boring, ugly men were talking, I had to listen to them because there was nothing more interesting to do.
Obviously, yeah.
Yeah. So it's actually the negative effect that we're going for there. So yeah, no, it's interesting stuff. So yeah, basically Jenny's like, hey, we have to go in there, and we have to, sort of like, because he's playing with all these people, and we see like a sort of montage of him in different forms because he keeps changing forms to interact with the different hostages that he's got, and whatever's going to happen here, this is probably going to kill him, and it's probably going to kill you too, but ultimately, he is scared, and Jenny even holds his hand, but it seems like he's into it, right? He's willing to do it, and we end with kind of the big moment of like going towards that, but it's also a sweet moment at the end though. After Jenny agrees to like take on this job for the Justice League, she asks for the address to this girl that was being talked about by the dad at the start of the issue, where she goes to this kid's bedroom and basically just tells the kid she's seen worse. Like, it's been worse in history, and tries to comfort her in her own weird way. It was kind of a nice bookend to the issue, in all honesty. But yeah, I think it's a solid issue. I like it more than the last issue, but I will say the idea of this book as a whole, while issue 1 was one of the most perfect first issues that I read all year, the rest of the book's not been Tom King's best work. It's it's good, but it's just not as interesting or as hard hitting emotionally as his Wonder Woman work, or even that first issue of Black Canary we just got. Now that's just one issue so far, and that could end up feeling like this one. That's possible. But his track record for me, and as silly as it sounds to Connor, is very high. So this being just like a middling book by his standards is, it is what it is. There's perspective to it for sure. So, no, but yeah. But the idea that the book's been gradually getting into like and maybe this is a complaint you could have about it as well. It's interesting for Tom King to reference actual things from the past 20 years, since the turn of the century, and this idea, this character, the century child of the 90s. Oh, sorry, I say the 90s, the 1900s, I should say. The century child of the 1900s having to be brought out of like death and retirement to try and give us some hope that things can be better is like a statement on like how bad things have been in this side of the century and like everything. And this idea that we're clinging to like the past to hope for better is, there's definitely some statements being made.
It's bold when you're comparing it to 2 world wars, isn't it?
It really is, actually. Yeah, when you think about what happened in the first half of that century.
Don't get me wrong, there's been some bad stuff, but let's take some perspective. There was some very, very bad stuff before as well, Yeah,
but I think that's why it's like specifically this idea that everyone who's alive just now doesn't remember that bad stuff because we weren't alive for it. So, but we remember the 90s being easier because a lot of us were alive for that. We were kids, even most of us. So,
yeah,
yeah, I think it's interesting, but you could argue that it would maybe be better if it was more subtext than actually just straight up talking about things that have been happening in the real world and placing it. Like, actually, I mean, they never say the names, they never say Trump, they never say Clinton, but they reference that election. It's clear what they're talking about.
It's from listening to you. Then it sounds very kind of Twitter politics. This good, this bad. This is the story, and it from what you say, it doesn't feel like there is much story. It feels. This is going to sound really strong. It's not as strong as I mean some, but it almost sounds like propaganda.
I don't think it does feel like that.
No, I don't think it reads like that. I'm not saying that. I'm saying hearing about it, and it feels like it kind of has a viewpoint and just this is good, this bad, and this is it. And even if I agree with most of those things, like it feels like there's not much story behind it. There's not much weight.
Well, yeah, but the point of it though isn't to say what is good and what is bad here. It's more about how we as a generation are like dealing with these things, as opposed to, you know, like, obviously it's coming from the view that is clearly on one side of it. Absolutely, but I don't think it's about trying to convince. Like, it's taken for granted that this is the bad thing. There's no debate about it. It's like, no, this is the bad thing, and this is the perspective the story's coming from. So it's not about trying to convince someone who disagrees with that to flip sides. It's more about just how are we actually coping with this. If we are all in agreement, and most of the people reading the book probably are in agreement, right? For the most part, what political views we're dealing with. Let's
be honest. If they weren't, they probably aren't still reading it.
For sure, yeah. It's more about how are we actually coping with this. And what if this has created Captain Atom? And Captain Atom's kind of a, you know, he's an allegory for, like, you know, the empowered person who wants to say they're God and all the rest of it. You know, he's definitely representing, like, you know, he lives in a society, is what I'm saying. Does Captain Atom. And the
Can't believe you just referenced that.
Look, as a shorthand, I got the point across I was trying to make. This is probably a solid 8 out of 10 issue, though. I liked it more than last issue. And I'm curious to see how this wraps up. I think we've got 2 left. I think there's maybe 7 issues.
That baffled me. What you just described did not sound like an 8 out of 10 issue.
It's still really well crafted. Like, it's still really well paced. The way it tells the story, the reactions from Jenny when she's with Batman and Superman. There's a lot of great stuff in here.